The Yidinji people of northeastern Australia remember a time when the shoreline extended far beyond where it ends today, when you could walk to what is now Fitzroy Island, when the Great Barrier Reef was dry land scattered with hills and rivers that no longer exist. They remember the names of places that are now underwater, and in 2016, when researchers compared these stories to geological records of ancient sea levels, the memories turned out to be accurate. The oldest of them described real coastlines from 13,000 years ago, 500 generations of human memory, no writing, no records, and the stories still match the rock beneath the sea. Now hold that fact gently in your mind and let it open a door. Because the Aboriginal Australians are not the only ones remembering. The Sumerians remember a flood. So do the Hebrews, the Hindus, the Maya, the Hopi, the Norse, the Polynesians, the Tamil kings of southern India. Over 200 cultures separated by oceans and millennia tell the same story. Not just about water rising, but about a warning given, a vessel prepared, a world destroyed, and a handful of survivors who carried forward the memory of something that was lost. If oral tradition can hold the shape of a drowned coastline for 13,000 years, what else might the oldest stories in the world be carrying? There is a legend, told in different forms by cultures on every inhabited continent, about a great land that once existed and was swallowed by the sea. A civilization that knew things we have forgotten, a catastrophe that erased it, and survivors who carried fragments of the old knowledge to every shore they could reach. One version of this legend calls the Lost Land Mu. It was given that name by a British writer in 1926, drawing on tablets he claimed to have seen in a temple in India, and a pattern in the world's oldest myths that he believed pointed to a single vanished source. Mainstream scholarship dismissed him almost immediately. The geology does not support a sunken continent in the Pacific. The tablets have never been independently verified. The man himself may have been sincere, may have been mistaken, and almost certainly was both. And yet the legend has refused for a century now to die. Tonight, we're going to find out why, not by arguing for it, not by arguing against it, but by walking inside it, slowly, gently, the way you walk through a museum after hours, when the lights are low and no one is watching and you can stand in front of something ancient for as long as you like. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day behind you start to fade. You don't have to follow every word. You don't have to remember anything. The story is going to move slowly. There is no test at the end. There is only an ocean and a legend and the sound of a voice carrying you towards sleep. You are safe here. Whatever happened today, whatever you are carrying from the hours before you lay down, you can set it beside you for now. It will still be there in the morning if you need it. Tonight, it is not required. We are going to the lost continent of Mu. We are going to walk its streets and meet its people and sit in its squares at sunset. We are going to watch, together and from a very safe distance, what the legend says happened on the night the ocean came. And we are going to ask, without needing to answer, whether the story is true, or whether it is something stranger than true. A memory so old that it has outlived the language it was first told in, the civilization that first told it, and the very land where it was first remembered. Let us begin. Every legend, no matter how old, eventually needs someone to write it down. The version of Mu that most of the world has heard traces back to a single man. A man whose biography is so strange, and whose claims are so extraordinary, that historians have spent nearly a century arguing about whether he was a visionary, a fraud, a sincere eccentric, or some impossible combination of all three. His name was James Churchward. He was born in England in the year 1851 in a small town called Bridestow in Devon, into a family with 8 siblings. He attended school, developed the interests of his era, ancient history, comparative religion, the mysterious pull of the East, and like many men of his class and time travelled toward India. The records of Churchward's actual movements in this period are thin, and this is one of the points his critics return to most often. He claimed to have been a colonel in the British forces in India. He claimed to have spent years in close study of languages and customs that no civilian would have had access to. How much of this is literally true, and how much of it is the self-mythology of an old man looking back on his youth, is something no one has ever fully sorted out. What we do know is that he was a tea planter in Sri Lanka, that he eventually emigrated to the United States in the 1890s, and that his path between Devon and those later years remains murky. But this is the story Churchward told. He said that one evening during his time in India, One account places it around 1868. During a period of famine relief, he was introduced to an elderly priest at a temple. The priest, according to Churchward, belonged to a brotherhood so old that its members were the direct inheritors of a tradition predating Hinduism itself. A tradition going back tens of thousands of years. The priest had something to show him. Deep within the temple, in a chamber not open to ordinary visitors, there was a collection of ancient tablets. They were not Sanskrit. They were not any language Churchward recognised. The script was a dense, ornate pattern of symbols that the priest called Nakal, the writing system of a people whose civilization had once stretched across the Pacific. The priest offered, over a period of years, to teach Churchward how to read them. And what the tablets said, once Churchward claimed to have learned to read them, was this. There had once been a great continent in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It had stretched from roughly the latitude of Hawaii in the north down past the equator, from the coast of what we now call Asia eastward, almost to the Americas. It had been enormous, larger than Australia. It had been home to 64 million people at its peak, the original civilization from which every later culture in the world had branched. Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, the Maya, the ancient Chinese dynasties, the Polynesian navigators. All of them, the tablets said, were descendants. Colonies. Refugee cultures. Founded in the centuries after Mu itself had been lost. And Mu itself had ended suddenly. A single catastrophic event, approximately 12,000 years ago. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, the ocean rushing in. Churchward published this first in 1926, in a book called The Lost Continent of Mu. It was followed by several more books over the next decade. The Children of Mu, The Sacred Symbols of Mu, Cosmic Forces of Mu. The response from the academic world was immediate, and it was not kind. Geologists pointed out correctly that the Pacific Ocean floor shows no evidence of a sunken continent. Plate tectonics, still a new and contested theory at the time Churchward wrote, now the bedrock of geological science, simply does not allow continents to drop into the ocean in a single night. Continents ride on tectonic plates, they do not sink. Linguists pointed out that no independent record of the Narkal language had ever been found. No other researcher had ever been shown his tablets. The priest could not be identified. The temple could not be located. Historians pointed out that many of the parallels Churchward drew between Mu and later cultures were either exaggerated, invented, or based on misreadings of genuine archaeological finds. Much of his framework, scholars later noted, drew heavily on the earlier work of Augustus Le Plongeon, who had proposed his own theories about a lost land called quote zero, based on what are now considered deeply flawed translations of Mayan texts. By the standards of evidence that any serious discipline would demand, Churchward's work failed. And yet, something about the story refused to go away. Part of it was the timing. Churchward was writing in the 1920s and 30s, at a moment when the Western imagination was hungry for lost civilizations. Howard Carter had just opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Troy had demonstrated 2 generations earlier that the stories Homer told were not pure invention, that there really had been a city there, and a war, and ruins still waiting under the soil. The idea that legend could sometimes turn out to be buried history was very much alive. Part of it was Churchward himself. By all accounts, he was compelling. He wrote with the confidence of someone delivering news rather than offering speculation. People who met him came away convinced that he was not, in any ordinary sense, a fraud. He believed what he was saying, and part of it, perhaps the biggest part, was that the story itself seemed to match something people already felt they remembered. Not from his book, from somewhere older, from the flood myths they had grown up with. Churchward had not invented the idea of a drowned homeland. That idea was already everywhere. What he had done was give it a specific name, a specific location, a specific timeline, and a specific people. He had taken a pattern that stretched across every continent and pinned it for the first time to a single place. Let me say it clearly before we go any further. There is no mainstream archaeological or geological support for a Pacific continent that sank 12,000 years ago. That claim has not been verified by any serious research since Churchward made it. What you're going to find tonight is something stranger, and in some ways more interesting. You're going to find a story that should never have survived, and yet has survived anyway. You're going to find a question that has no easy answer, and that is sometimes the most honest kind of question there is. So set Churchward aside for now. He was the modern messenger. The message, if there is one, is much older. Close your eyes if they are not closed already. Let the pictures come when they come, and let them drift away when they drift away. You are standing on a long, pale beach on the edge of an ocean that has not yet been named. The sand under your feet is warm, not hot, and the grains of it are fine, finer than any sand you have stood on before. It has the softness of something that was made carefully, over centuries, by a coastline that has been stable for a very long time. Behind you, in the direction of the land, a city is rising. You cannot see all of it at once. It is too big. What you can see from the beach is a series of low white walls and gardens, rising up in terraces along the slope of a hillside. Beyond those terraces, the dark shapes of larger buildings. Beyond those, farther inland, the suggestion of something enormous, a structure at the centre of the city that catches the morning light in a way that nothing else does. The air smells of salt and of something floral that you do not have a name for. A flower that does not exist in the world you came from. You begin to walk inland. The path up from the beach is paved in a kind of stone you have never seen before. Dark, almost black, with faint veins of gold running through it. Volcanic stone from the mountains in the interior of the continent, shaped and polished by craftspeople who understood the grain of it the way a woodworker understands the grain of an old tree. Each paving block fits against its neighbours so exactly that you cannot slide a fingernail between them. The path rises in a gentle curve, not a straight line. The legend is specific about this. The Nacal did not build in straight lines unless there was a reason to. They understood that the body moves more naturally along curves, that a city walked in curves rather than grids produces a different quality of mind in its walkers. You feel this as you walk. Your breathing, without your noticing, has slowed a little. The first people you pass are two women carrying baskets of yellow fruit between them, smooth and about the size of an apple. They smile in the relaxed way of people who live in a place where strangers are unusual enough to notice but not unusual enough to alarm. One of them nods to you. You nod back. Neither of you speaks, and yet something has been exchanged. A small warm acknowledgement, and it is enough. You continue up the path. The buildings on either side of you are low and white, their walls made of something that looks like plaster, but holds the warmth differently. You pass an open doorway and see, inside, a room with low cushions along the walls, shallow bowls of water on platforms, what appear to be plants growing directly out of the floor, their roots sustained by an arrangement you cannot quite see. The light comes from small openings in the ceiling placed so precisely that no corner is in shadow, no surface in glare. A child runs past you in the street chasing something, a small animal, or a ball, or simply a feeling, and laughs, and disappears around a corner. The laugh echoes off the pale walls for a moment and then fades. You realise slowly that the city is almost silent, not because it is empty. There are people everywhere, walking, carrying, working, sitting in small groups in the shade, thousands of people within the sound of your breathing. And yet the overall impression is one of quiet, a deep, settled, unhurried quiet, as if everyone in Mu has agreed without needing to agree that the city itself is something to be listened to rather than shouted over. The legend says that Mu had 7 great cities, each built according to the same principles, but with different purposes. One for healers, one for navigators, one for builders, one for growers, one for teachers, one for the keepers of memory, and one, the oldest and most sacred, a city of listeners. You reach the top of the rise. From here, for the first time, you can see the centre of the city clearly. At the heart of every Nacal city, the story says, there stood a temple built around a single enormous crystal formation rising out of the ground. The formation was natural, a vein of clear quartz and other mineral that rose out of the bedrock like a frozen fountain, as tall as a tower, its upper faces catching the sunlight and throwing it back in a way that made the surrounding air shimmer. The Nacal had built a structure around the crystal, but not over it. The temple was open at the top. The crystal rose through the open ceiling, untouched, uncut, exactly as the earth had made it. Around its base they had arranged chambers for listening, for healing, for what the story calls attunement, bringing the rhythms of a human body back into alignment with the rhythms of the larger world. People came to the temple not to pray to anything. The Nakal, according to the story, did not pray in the sense that later cultures would develop. They did not ask favours of gods. They did not bargain for outcomes. What they did was listen. The temple was the best place on the continent to listen, because the crystal at its centre was doing something to the information that was always passing through the air and the ground, something you cannot quite name even standing here, but that you can feel at the edge of your awareness, the way you can feel a low note in a piece of music in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The legend says the Nakal understood the human body as a system in resonance with its environment, not a machine, not a chemistry set. A system whose health or sickness depended on whether its internal rhythms were in alignment with the larger rhythms of the planet and the stars. Healing in Mu, according to the story, took place in these temples. People would lie in the chambers near the crystal for days, sometimes weeks, doing nothing but listening. And the listening, the legend says, was the medicine. Is any of this literally true? We do not know. Quartz crystals do have physical properties that are real and useful. They oscillate at precise frequencies under electrical stimulation, which is why they are used into modern watches and electronic circuits. Whether a large natural quartz formation could produce effects on the human body that we have not yet learned to measure is not physically impossible. It is simply unsupported. But the larger principle the legend describes, that the body is a system in conversation with its environment, and that health depends on the quality of that conversation, is one that modern medicine is slowly, through its own tools and its own vocabulary, beginning to take seriously. You do not go into the temple today. Visitors did not enter on their first day in a Nakal city. There was a period of preparation first. Instead, you turn and walk slowly back down the path into the streets of the city and let yourself be carried by it. The morning has moved on while you are not watching it. The sun is higher. The markets have opened, although market may not be the right word for what you are seeing. In the plaza in front of you, there are tables arranged around the edge of the open space. Food, textiles, tools, small carved objects. People standing behind the tables, people walking among them, people pausing to talk, and no money, of any kind, is changing hands. The legend describes the economy of Mu as one of the most difficult things for modern minds to picture honestly. The Nakal did not use money. They did not barter in any formal sense. What they had was something more subtle, and it worked because the population had been practicing it for thousands of years. Each person was raised from childhood to understand their own contribution, what they were for, what their particular combination of temperament and talent was best suited to provide. Some people grew food, some people taught children, some people tended the sick, some people kept the records of the stars, some people did the quiet and necessary work that keeps a city running, carried water, cleaned streets, repaired walls, and this work was not considered lesser. It was simply different, and the person who did it was no less honoured. What any individual brought to the plaza was whatever they had produced that the community needed. What any individual took was whatever they themselves needed. There was no record kept. In a city where everyone had grown up knowing everyone else, and where the long memory of the community was something every child absorbed by the time they could walk to the plaza alone, the idea of taking more than you needed was almost unthinkable. Not because it was forbidden, but because it had no meaning. This may be fantasy. It almost certainly idealizes any real society that ever existed, including any that may have lived 12,000 years ago. But the dream survives in the memory of our species because the species cannot quite let go of it. You take a piece of flatbread from one of the tables. It tastes like bread, but also like something else. A faint sweetness. A depth to the grain you have not found in any bread you have eaten at home. The legend says the Nakal understood that food was not separate from medicine, that every plant they grew, every grain they ground, every fruit they picked, had effects on the body and on the mind that could be predicted and adjusted. They did not farm in our sense. They cultivated, they guided, they worked with the land rather than against it, and the land responded by producing food that was, according to the story, part of the reason the Nakal lived so much longer than we do now. Whether this is true in any literal sense does not matter tonight. What matters is the taste of this bread in your mouth, warm, dense, faintly sweet, and the feeling of standing in a plaza where the food is there for anyone who needs it, and no one is watching to see how much you take. Around a corner, you come into a smaller square where a teacher is sitting with a group of children. Maybe 12 of them, ranging in age from very small to almost grown. The teacher is older. Her hair is silver, her hands folded, her face patient in the way of someone who's done this same work for 40 years and still loves it. She's not lecturing, she's asking questions, and the children are answering, and she's listening to their answers with a seriousness that would be startling in any school you have ever seen. The legend says that education in Mu was not about the transmission of facts. It was about the slow unfolding of a child's own nature. The teacher's job was not to fill the student. It was to notice who the student already was, what subjects they drifted toward when no one was watching, what questions they asked when no one told them to, what they dreamed about, what made them quiet, what made them come alive, and to help the student notice the same thing. By the time a child reached what we would call adolescence, the story says, they knew what they were, not in every detail, but in essence. They knew whether they belonged near the temple or near the fields or near the ships or near the quiet rooms where the old scrolls were kept. There was no crisis of career. There was no agonized searching for meaning. The meaning had been there all along, and the work of childhood had been to find it. Evening comes. The sky over Mu, as the sun drops toward the western ocean, turns amber, then deep rose, then a violet so intense it seems to come from inside the clouds. People gather in the streets and squares. Small fires are lit in braziers. Food is brought out. Old people sit on benches that have been their benches for decades and tell stories to whoever wants to listen. The afternoon had passed slowly while you walked. You passed through quarters of the city you will not remember in detail tomorrow. A street of weavers, their looms set up in the open air under long cloth awnings, their hands moving in rhythms older than the city itself. A quarter of potters, their kilns glowing behind them, their finished bowls stacked in drying rows in the sun. A long garden that seemed to run for several blocks, in which people of all ages were walking slowly and silently, as if the garden itself were a meditation that did not require instruction. At one point you passed a low building from which the sound of singing was coming. A single voice, at first, and then several, joining in. The song had no words you recognized. It had a shape like a wave, rising, cresting, falling, rising again, and something about it made your eyes fill with tears that you could not explain. You did not go in. The song was not for you, or it was for everyone, which amounts to the same thing. You stood in the street for a moment and listened, and then you walked on. Now you find a place on the edge of one of the squares and sit down. The voices are low, the fires are warm. Somewhere in the distance, the ocean, still there, still patient, still doing its slow work against the long pale beach. This is a day in Mu, or, more honestly, this is what 12,000 years of human memory has preserved of what a day in Mu might have been like, filtered through the longing of every generation that passed the story forward, refined and softened in the retelling, until what comes down to us is less a history than a hope. You do not have to decide tonight whether any of it is real. You only have to sit here, on the edge of the square, with the fires warm and the voices low and the ocean waiting in the distance, and let yourself believe it for a little while. The way you believed the stories you were told as a very small child, before you knew the word for story. For now you are in Mu. The rest of the legend can wait. Before we go deeper into the legend, let us stop and consider something that changes the shape of the whole question. Because while the specific continent Churchward described, a Pacific landmass the size of South America that sank in a single night, is not supported by geology, the broader claim underneath the legend is something else entirely. The claim that the end of the last ice age drowned vast areas of inhabited land is not a legend at all. It is a fact. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, so much of the Earth's water was locked in ice sheets that the global sea level was approximately 120 metres lower than it is today. To grasp what that means, picture the coastlines of every continent extending outward by miles, in some places by hundreds of miles. Entire continental shelves that are now underwater were dry land. Land where people lived, built shelters, hunted, fished, gathered, and formed the earliest communities we would recognise as human societies. And then the ice began to melt. The sea did not rise smoothly. It came in pulses, periods of rapid flooding interspersed with periods of relative stability. Researchers have identified at least two major episodes of catastrophically fast sea level rise. The first, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred roughly 14,500 years ago. During this event, The global sea level may have risen by as much as 20 metres in as little as 500 years, a rate that would have been noticeable within a single human lifetime. Coastlines would have moved inland visibly from one generation to the next. Villages that grandparents had built would have been underwater before their grandchildren were old. A second major pulse, meltwater, Pulse 1b, struck around 11,500 years ago. By the time the sea levels finally stabilised near their present heights, roughly 7,000 years ago, more than 25 million square kilometres of land that had been habitable during the Ice Age had disappeared beneath the ocean. That is an area roughly the size of North America. 25 million square kilometres. Gone. And this is not speculation. This is the geological record. To put that loss in human terms, imagine living in a coastal community. Your grandparents built the village. You grew up there. You know every path, every fishing spot, every tree. And then, over the course of your adult life, the sea moves inland by several hundred metres, not in a single wave, not as a Hollywood catastrophe, but slowly, persistently, undeniably. The beach where you played as a child is gone. The fishing grounds your father used are too deep to reach. The path to the neighbouring village now goes through ankle-deep water at high tide. By the time you're old, the place you grew up is underwater, and your grandchildren will never see it. Now multiply that experience across every coastline on Earth, sustained over thousands of years. Every generation watching the water come a little farther. Every generation having to move a little higher, a little inland. Every generation telling their children, it was not always like this. There was more land once. The world was bigger. That is the experience that the flood myths are remembering. Not a single event, a sustained, multi-generational trauma, the slow drowning of the world the Ice Age people had known, compressed in the retelling into a single night. Because stories work that way. Stories compress. They take something that happened over centuries and give it the shape of a single experience, because a single experience is what a listener can hold. Now consider where some of that land was. In the North Sea, between what is now Britain and the European mainland, there once existed a landmass that archaeologists have named Doggerland. At its peak it stretched from Britain's east coast to the Netherlands and Denmark. It was populated by Mesolithic communities who left behind stone tools, antler harpoons, and the bones of animals they hunted. It is not a myth. It has been mapped in detail using seismic survey data. Fishing trawlers have been dragging up evidence of it for over a century, and it was drowned by the same rising seas that reshaped every coastline on Earth. If the North Sea hides a lost world, then so does every shallow sea on the planet. Now look southeast, toward the region the legend of Mu actually describes. During the same ice age, an even larger landmass existed in what is now the Shallow Sea, between mainland Southeast Asia and the islands of Indonesia. Geologists call it Sunderland. It connected the Malay Peninsula to Sumatra, Java, Borneo and Bali into a single continuous tropical continent, larger than modern India. The equator ran through its centre. It was warm, forested, crossed by ancient river systems, whose channels can still be traced on the seabed, and populated by human communities for at least 50,000 years. Sunderland began submerging around 18,000 years ago. The process was not gentle. A 2023 study published in Communications Biology, using population genomic analysis of 763 whole genome sequences from 59 ethnic groups, demonstrated that the rapid sea level rises of meltwater pulse 1a and 1b reduced Sunderland's land area by more than 50%. The study found direct genetic evidence that these flooding events triggered forced human migrations. Populations that had lived on the Sunda Shelf for tens of thousands of years were pushed outward, some travelling as far as South Asia. The land that now lies beneath the Java Sea, the South China Sea, and the Strait of Malacca was once the heartland of human habitation in Southeast Asia. It is gone now, swallowed by the same rising waters that took Doggerland, that took the coastal plains of every continent, that took whatever was built along 25 million square kilometres of shoreline that no longer exists. Here is the question the legend of Mu is really asking underneath all the mythology. If we know, not suspect, not theorise, but know from hard geological and genetic evidence, that vast inhabited landscapes disappeared beneath the ocean at the end of the last ice age, and if we know that the people who lived on those landscapes survived and migrated and carried their memories with them, And if we know that those memories, in at least some documented cases, have persisted for 7,000 years or more in oral tradition, then what else was lost that we have not yet found? What was built on those 25 million square kilometres during the tens of thousands of years they were above water? What cultures formed there? What knowledge was developed? What was carried away by the survivors, and what was left behind for the ocean to cover? The legend of Mu answers these questions with a specific story about a specific continent. The geology does not support that specific story, but the geology does support the underlying premise, that a great deal of inhabited land was lost to the sea at the end of the Ice Age, and that whatever was on that land is now beyond our easy reach. This is the space in which the legend lives, not in the gap between truth and fiction, in the gap between what we know was lost and what we have not yet found. There are things the earliest recorded civilizations seem to have known that do not fit easily into the story of how they are supposed to have developed, and the strangeness of that knowledge is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is one of the quiet engines driving the legend of Mu, the observation, made independently by researchers in many different fields, that the oldest cultures on Earth seem to have arrived already knowing things that should have taken them much longer to figure out. Start with the stars. Every ancient culture that survived into the period of written records seems to have arrived with astronomical knowledge that, at first glance, does not match the technological level of the rest of its civilization. The Egyptians aligned the Great Pyramid at Giza with true north to within roughly 4 minutes of arc, a precision that required either centuries of patient observation or inherited knowledge from an older source. The Maya calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time between its successive appearances as the morning star, to within a few hours of the value modern astronomers measure with instruments the Maya never possessed. The Vedic astronomers of ancient India described a cycle called the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that takes approximately 26,000 years to complete, and described it accurately, in texts compiled long before any instrument existed that could measure it directly. This last detail is worth pausing on. The precession of the equinoxes is not something you notice in a single lifetime. The effect is subtle. The positions of the stars shift by about 1 degree every 72 years, which means that the constellation visible behind the Sun at the spring equinox changes so slowly that several generations would have to pass before the shift became obvious to naked eye observers. To work out the full cycle, to understand that the shift is not random but circular, and that the circle takes approximately 26,000 years to complete, you would need either an unbroken tradition of astronomical observations stretching back many thousands of years, or a mathematical model sophisticated enough to extrapolate the full cycle from a small observed arc. The Vedic texts contain references to precessional periods. The Egyptian traditions encode numbers that correspond to precessional math. The number 72, the number of years it takes for 1 degree of precessional shift, appears repeatedly in Egyptian mythology and architecture. The Maya long count calendar measures time in spans that are only meaningful when considered against precessional motion. The historian of science Giorgio de Santillana and his colleague Herta von der Schend documented these patterns in their 1969 study Hamlet's Mill, a work that argued, controversially but in painstaking detail, that precessional knowledge was encoded in the myths and sacred narratives of cultures across the ancient world. How did these cultures know what they knew? The mainstream answer is patient observation across many generations. That explanation is probably largely correct. But the legend of Mu offers a supplementary question. What if some of the oldest astronomical knowledge did not emerge independently in each culture, but was inherited? What if the survivors of an earlier period, from lands now beneath the sea, carried forward fragments of a tradition refined over tens of thousands of uninterrupted years? The question is sharpened considerably by a site in southeastern Turkey that has rewritten the timeline of what human beings were capable of long before the first cities of Mesopotamia. Start with Göbekli Tepe. In the Germish mountains of southeastern Turkey, roughly 12 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa, there is an archaeological site that has quietly rewritten the timeline of human civilization since its systematic excavation began in 1995 under the direction of the German Archaeological Institute's Klaus Schmidt. The site consists of massive circular enclosures containing T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing nearly 6 meters tall and weighing between 7 and 10 tons. They are carved with elaborate reliefs: snakes, foxes, boars, vultures, abstract symbols, and they were erected by people we still classify as hunter-gatherers in the period between roughly 9,600 and 8,200 BCE. That date is important. Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by roughly 7,000 years. It was built before the invention of pottery, before the domestication of animals, before agriculture, or at least before what the traditional timeline says agriculture should have been possible, and the discoveries have not stopped. Only about 10% of the site has been excavated. Archaeologists estimate that at least 15 more enclosures remain buried. In 2023, excavators working under the current dig team leader Nekmi Karel uncovered a life-sized painted wild boar statue in Enclosure D, decorated with red, white and black pigment, making it one of the oldest known painted sculptures in the world. It was situated on a pedestal adorned with what appeared to be an H-shaped symbol, a crescent, 2 snakes and 3 human faces. In 2025, a human statue featuring clearly defined head and torso characteristics was unearthed between enclosures B and D. At the nearby sister site of Karahan Tepe, a 2.3-metre tall human statue, one of the most realistic from this period ever found, was discovered in a seated position on a stone bench, holding a phallus in both hands. The discovery of domestic structures alongside the monumental architecture at both sites has challenged the original theory that Göbekli Tepe was purely a ceremonial pilgrimage destination. People lived here. They built monuments and homes together, long before the textbooks say permanent settlement should have been possible. And then there is the matter of the carvings. In 2024, Martin Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh published a study in the journal Time and Mind arguing that V-shaped symbols carved into one of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe represent individual days in a solar calendar, a lunisolar calendar of 365 days, consisting of 12 lunar months plus 11 extra days. If Sweatman's interpretation is correct, it would be the oldest known calendar system by thousands of years. Other researchers remain cautious. The interpretation is controversial and has not achieved consensus, but the possibility that hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago were tracking the movements of the sun, moon and constellations with this degree of precision is no longer something that can be casually dismissed. Where did this knowledge come from? The mainstream answer is patient observation over many generations. That is almost certainly part of the truth. But the legend of Mu offers a supplementary question. What if some of the oldest, astronomical and architectural knowledge in the world did not emerge independently in each culture, but was inherited, carried forward in fragments by survivors of an earlier period, from lands that are now beneath the sea? Move from the stars to the stones. Around the world, in places separated by oceans, there are megalithic structures whose construction raises questions that have never been fully settled. Not because we lack theories, but because every theory requires either extraordinary labour forces we have no evidence of, or techniques whose specifics have been lost. The megaliths of Pumapunku in Bolivia, shaped from andesite and red sandstone with a precision that continues to puzzle researchers. The moai of Easter Island, 80 tons apiece, moved from inland quarries to the coast by a population whose own oral tradition says the statues walked. The basalt columns of Nan Madol in Micronesia stacked into walls on artificial islands in the middle of the open ocean. And now consider a site that has divided the archaeological community more bitterly than almost any other in recent years. Gunung Padang in West Java, Indonesia. A megalithic complex perched 885 metres above sea level, consisting of 5 terraces bordered by retaining walls of naturally forming hexagonal andesite columns. Volcanic stone remarkably similar in shape to the basalt used at Nan Madol thousands of kilometres away across the Pacific. The Sundanese people consider the site sacred. Local legend says it was built by King Siliwangi in a single night. The conventional archaeological dating by researchers such as Lutfi Yondri of the University of Padjadjaran places the site's construction within the last 2,000 years, making it one of the oldest stepped temples, called Punden Berundak, in Indonesia. But in 2023, Indonesian geologist Danny Hillman Natawijaja published a paper in Archaeological Prospection claiming, based on radiocarbon dating of organic soils and remote sensing data, that the site conceals multiple construction layers extending back as far as 27,000 years, deep into the Paleolithic. If true, it would be the oldest known pyramid structure in the world. The paper was retracted in March 2024. The publisher stated that the radiocarbon dating was applied to soil samples not associated with any artifacts that could be reliably interpreted as human-made construction. The retraction was sharp and definitive, and yet the controversy has not ended. In October 2025, Indonesia's Ministry of Culture announced the resumption of excavation and restoration at Gunung Padang under the direction of a new multidisciplinary team, with carbon samples from each terrace being sent for fresh laboratory analysis. The question of what lies beneath Gunung Padang remains formally open. Why does this matter for the legend of Mu? Because Gunung Padang sits on the northern edge of what was once Sundaland. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were 120 metres lower, this entire region was dry land, a continuous tropical continent stretching south and west, rich with rivers and forests and human populations. If any version of the legend's claim is true, that an older civilization existed somewhere in the Pacific or its margins, and that fragments of its knowledge were carried forward, then Sundaland and its highland edges are exactly where we would expect to find traces of it. The traces, if they exist, are mostly underwater. Gunung Padang is one of the few places high enough to have stayed above the flood. The question is, what is buried inside it? There is one piece of evidence for the broad outlines of the Mu legend that even the most sceptical historian cannot entirely wave away. It is the pattern of the flood myths. Researchers have documented well over 200 distinct flood narratives from cultures all over the world. Some estimates run as high as 500. Many of these stories were told by peoples who, by every available measure of geography and history, had no contact with one another at the time they developed their accounts. And the stories do not just share the theme of flooding, they share a specific sequence. A warning is delivered, often to a single chosen person or family. The chosen one prepares, sometimes by building a vessel, sometimes by climbing a mountain, sometimes by gathering the seeds and the memory of the old world. The water comes, catastrophically. A small number of survivors make it through. They land somewhere when the waters recede, and they begin to rebuild, often with the conscious awareness that something has been permanently lost, that the world they now inhabit is a smaller, poorer, less knowing version of the world their ancestors came from. The Sumerian version appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of long literature in the world, with a hero named Utnapishtim warned by the god Ea that the world is going to be destroyed. A parallel and even older tradition tells the same story with a hero named Ziusudra. The Hebrew version, the story of Noah, follows the Mesopotamian structure so closely that most scholars believe the two are related, either through direct borrowing or through shared descent from an older source. The Hindu version tells of Manu warned by a fish, later revealed as an avatar of Vishnu, that the world is going to be destroyed by water. Manu builds a boat. He survives, along with the 7 sages, the Saptarishi, the 7 great teachers of the old world who carry forward the knowledge that the new humanity will need. 7 sages, 7 great teachers, told thousands of miles from any place that knew the Sumerians existed. The Maya version, preserved in the Popol Vuh, describes multiple ages of the world, each ending in a catastrophe, one of which is a flood. The people who survive are given the knowledge of the stars and the calendar by teachers who came from across a great body of water. The Polynesian traditions follow the same shape. The Hawaiian accounts speak of a great flood sent by the god Cain. The Tahitian accounts tell of a flood covering the entire world except the highest mountains. The Maori preserve a story of a great deluge told in a language that had diverged from the common Polynesian stock thousands of years before any Maori saw a European. But it is the Australian traditions that have forced even the most cautious scholars to take the pattern seriously. In a landmark 2016 study published in the Australian Geographer, marine geographer Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast and linguist Nicholas Reed of the University of New England analysed Aboriginal oral traditions from 21 separate locations around Australia's coastline. Each tradition described a time when the shoreline was significantly farther out than it is today, when areas now underwater were dry land, when people hunted kangaroo on plains that are now seabed. What Nunn and Reed did was compare the details in these stories. Which specific areas the tradition said had been dry, how far out the old coastline had extended, with scientific reconstructions of prehistoric sea levels. The results suggested that the stories describe real events dating back between 7,250 and 13,070 years ago. The traditions were not metaphorical. They were observational. The people who told them had actually watched the sea come in and cover land their grandparents had walked on. And the traditions had been passed down, generation to generation, for 7,000 years or more, without written records, in cultures separated by thousands of kilometres along the Australian coastline, each telling essentially the same kind of story, of the sea rising over areas that had previously been dry. None noted that the isolation of Australia is likely part of the explanation for why these stories survive so long. But he also pointed to the nature of Aboriginal storytelling itself, a conservative and explicit approach to transmitted knowledge, kin-based systems for tracking accuracy, a cultural infrastructure designed to preserve information across deep time. If oral traditions in Australia can preserve accurate memories of real environmental events for 7,000 to 13,000 years, then the question of how far back other oral traditions might reach becomes suddenly uncomfortably open. The standard academic explanation for the worldwide pattern of flood myths is convergent mythology. Humans everywhere experience floods, and so they tell flood stories. This explains some of the pattern, but it does not easily explain the specific shared sequence of warning, preparation, catastrophe, survival, rebuilding, and loss. It does not easily explain why cultures whose lands have not experienced world-ending floods in living memory still tell world-ending flood stories, and it does not easily explain why the rough date encoded in so many of the traditions, the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, matches the actual period of the most dramatic sea level rise in recent geological history. Something happened. The Earth warmed, the ice caps melted, the oceans rose, coastlines that had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years went under. The people who lived there had to move. Whether the land that went under was a single great continent in the Pacific, as Churchward claimed, or many separate coastal regions on every continent at once, the experience of the people who lived through it would have been the same. They would have watched their world disappear. They would have told their children about it, and the story, passed down across thousands of years of oral tradition, would have softened and shifted until the original event was hard to see clearly through the layers of retelling. But the shape of it would remain. The shape is still here, still. There is another piece of the timeline that deserves attention tonight, because it sits at exactly the moment the legend says everything changed, and because the scientific debate around it has refused, for nearly 20 years now, to settle. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth was warming, the Ice Age was ending, temperatures were rising, the glaciers were retreating, and then, abruptly, the warming stopped. In the span of decades, perhaps even years, temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere plunged back toward glacial conditions and stayed there for roughly 1,200 years. This cold snap is called the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic wildflower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in the geological layers corresponding to this period. The Younger Dryas is one of the most studied climate events in Earth science. What caused it remains genuinely unsettled. The conventional explanation involves a disruption of ocean circulation, a massive release of glacial meltwater from a North American ice lake called Lake Agassiz into the Atlantic Ocean, which slowed or halted the thermohaline circulation that carries warm water northward, effectively switching off the heat pump that kept the Northern Hemisphere warming. This explanation is well supported but has not fully accounted for all the evidence, and its originator, the geochemist Wallace Broecker, changed his own position on the mechanism multiple times before his death in 2019. In 2007, a team led by nuclear physicist Richard Firestone and colleagues proposed an alternative, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. They argued that fragments of a large comet struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere around 12,800 years ago, triggering wildfires across the continent, destabilizing ice sheets and plunging the planet into the sudden cold snap. The hypothesis was formally introduced in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and generated immediate controversy. The debate that followed has been one of the most bitter in modern Earth science, and it is still ongoing. Independent research teams have since reported finding signature materials associated with cosmic impacts, platinum anomalies, magnetic microspherules, melt glass, nanodiamonds, and shock-fractured quartz, at more than 50 Younger Dryas boundary sites across 5 continents. The hypothesis has been declared dead and revived multiple times, As of this telling, the question of what caused the Younger Dryas remains genuinely open. What is not open, what is not in dispute, is what happened during it. The sudden return to near-glacial conditions caused massive ecological disruption. Many of the large animals of the Pleistocene, the woolly mammoth, the giant ground sloth, the saber-toothed cat, disappeared during or shortly after this period. Human populations across the northern hemisphere were displaced, disrupted, forced to adapt or die. And in the Near East, the centuries immediately following the Younger Dryas saw the first emergence of agriculture, as if the cold snap had forced a fundamental change in how human beings related to the land they lived on. Göbekli Tepe itself was built at the tail end of the Younger Dryas, during the centuries when the cold was finally lifting. Whatever community or communities built it, they did so during or immediately after one of the most traumatic periods in human prehistory, a period of sudden cold, ecological collapse, and mass extinction. The monuments they built are the oldest known. The knowledge they encoded in stone is sophisticated in ways we are still trying to understand, and the timing, the fact that the greatest burst of monumental construction in the Neolithic record occurs at exactly the moment when the Earth was recovering from a catastrophe, raises a question that the legend of Mu answers in its own way. Was Göbekli Tepe built by survivors? Not necessarily survivors of a sunken continent. Perhaps survivors of a culture that had existed on the now submerged coastlines of the eastern Mediterranean, or the Black Sea basin, or the continental shelves that were inundated during the meltwater pulses. Perhaps a community that had been displaced by the catastrophe and had arrived in the highlands of southeastern Turkey, carrying knowledge and traditions from a place that no longer existed. The mainstream archaeological view does not require this interpretation. It is possible that the builders of Göbekli Tepe developed their monumental architecture locally, over generations, without any input from elsewhere, but the possibility that they were building on a foundation of inherited knowledge from a displaced coastal culture is not a possibility that the evidence rules out, and the timing is striking. The Younger Dryas begins at almost exactly the moment the legend of Mu says the continent was destroyed, approximately 12,800 years ago. It overlaps with the approximate dates encoded in many of the world's flood myths. It coincides with a period of genuine catastrophic environmental change that would have been experienced by the human populations living through it as an ending. Was there a comet? Was there a flood? Was there a continent? The legend does not need a specific mechanism to make its point. The point is that something happened at the boundary between the Ice Age and the modern world that was traumatic enough for the human species to remember it for 12,000 years. The legend of Mu is one way of remembering it. The flood myths are another. The Younger Dryas boundary layer, with its platinum and its microspherals and its shock-fractured quartz, may be the geological record of whatever the legends are pointing at, or it may not. The science is not settled. But the question remains open, and the question is worth holding as you drift. Set the flood myths and the climate science aside for a moment and look at the Pacific itself. The Pacific Ocean covers more than 30% of the planet's surface. All the continents could fit inside it with room to spare. And for most of human history, it was the least known part of the world to anyone writing down history anywhere else. And yet the Pacific was not empty. It was crossed, long before European sailors reached it, by the Polynesian voyagers, men and women who navigated thousands of miles of open ocean, using the stars, the currents, the flight patterns of birds, and memorized charts of wave motion that told a trained navigator where they were in relation to invisible islands below the horizon. The mainstream archaeological picture, supported by linguistic and genetic evidence, traces the Polynesian peoples to the area of present-day Taiwan and coastal Southeast Asia, migrating eastward in successive waves over several thousand years. But the legend of Mu suggests that the Polynesian navigators were inheritors of a much older seafaring tradition, one that had reached its peak on the lost continent itself, and that the knowledge of the stars and the waves that allowed the Polynesians to cross the Pacific was a fragment of something developed over tens of thousands of years of voyaging. The navigational techniques the Polynesians used were not simple. They involved reading the subtle patterns of ocean swells reflecting off distant islands, interpreting the behaviour of specific bird species at specific distances from land, and memorising vast mental charts of star positions that changed with latitude. This is not knowledge that develops quickly. It is knowledge that requires generations of refinement, the kind of deep, patient accumulation that the legend says the Nakal had practiced for 50,000 years on an ocean they called home. And scattered across the Pacific are monuments that pose questions the standard timeline does not fully answer. Take Easter Island. Nearly 1,000 moai, carved from volcanic tuff in the quarry at Ranararaku, moved across miles of uneven terrain, erected on stone platforms facing the ocean. Some weigh 80 tons. The largest unfinished moai, still lying in the quarry, stands over 21 metres tall and would have weighed an estimated 270 tons. The Rapa Nui, the descendants of Polynesian voyagers who reached the island around the first millennium CE, are not a mystery. Their society, its phases, its collapse, are well documented. But the question of how they moved and raised the moai has never been fully settled. Their own answer, when asked by early European visitors, was simple. The statues walked. Modern researchers have experimented with ways to make this literally true. In 2011, archaeologists Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt demonstrated that a moai could be rocked forward in a walking motion using ropes and a coordinated team, and the technique was plausible enough to generate serious discussion. But the real mystery is not the mechanics of transport. It is the ambition. What drives a population of fewer than 15,000 people on a remote island in the middle of the Pacific to carve 900 monumental statues from a volcanic hillside and line them up along the coast, all of them facing inland as if they were watching over the island's inhabitants? The Rapa Nui's own traditions say the statues contain mana, spiritual power, and that they were erected to honour the ancestors. The ancestors, in the oldest versions of the stories, came from a homeland across the water that is no longer there. Take Nan Madol, on the reef off the eastern side of Pohnpei in Micronesia. A city built entirely on water, roughly 92 artificial islands separated by canals, constructed from massive basalt columns stacked log cabin style into walls and platforms and tombs. Some individual columns weigh up to 5 tons. The heaviest basalt boulders at the site may weigh 50 tons or more. The columns are naturally formed prismatic shapes created by cooling lava flows, hexagonal and pentagonal cross-sections, remarkably regular, as if the earth itself had shaped building materials for whoever was willing to come and collect them. The city was the ceremonial and administrative centre of the Sodler dynasty, which ruled Pohnpei for several centuries before being overthrown around the 1620s. Carbon dating of material from the site suggests construction began around 1180 CE, with some earlier phases possibly dating to the 8th or 9th century. That alone is remarkable. A city on artificial islands in the open ocean, built and maintained for half a millennium by a society that left no written record of itself beyond the stories told by the people it ruled. But the oral traditions of Pohnpei add a layer that the archaeological record cannot confirm or deny. They say the city was not built by the ancestors of the current population. It was built by 2 brothers, Olisihpa and Olosohpa, who came from a mythical western land called Katau, sometimes described as a distant island, sometimes as a great land that no longer exists, and who used methods the stories describe as magical to move the massive stones into position. One version of the tradition mentions a flying dragon. Another mentions chanting that caused the stones to rise. Stripped of the mythological language, the stories describe the arrival of strangers from elsewhere who possessed construction techniques that seemed impossible to the local population. The basalt columns of Nan Madol are, interestingly, almost identical in form to the andesite columns used in the construction of Gunung Padang in West Java, a resemblance noted in the 2023 Natawijaja paper before its retraction. Both sites used naturally occurring columnar-jointed volcanic stone. Both sites involved the transport of very heavy material over difficult terrain. Both sites are associated with local traditions that attribute their construction to outsiders with abilities the local population did not possess. Whether this is coincidence or connection is something the evidence cannot yet decide. Take the Yonaguni Formation off the southern coast of Japan, discovered by diver Kihachiro Arataki in 1986. A series of terraces and flat surfaces and right angles in the rock at the seabed that has divided researchers ever since. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus has argued the formations are man-made stepped monoliths. Geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University maintains they are entirely natural, the product of the fracture patterns of sandstone. The debate may never be settled. What is settled is that the formation sits in water that was dry land during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower. Whatever it is, natural or artificial, it was above water during the period the legend says Mu still existed. The Pacific does not prove the legend of Mu. The existence of unexplained monuments in a region does not mean that any specific legend about that region is correct. Human beings have always built monuments in unexpected places, and the mysteries of Easter Island and Nan Madol and Yonaguni may have perfectly earthly explanations that we will work out in time. But the Pacific keeps the question open. It refuses to close. Mu is not alone. There are other lost continent legends in the world, and the relationship between them is one of the more interesting tangles in the whole story. Sometimes they seem to be describing the same place under different names. Sometimes they seem to be describing different places that are easily confused. Sometimes they seem to be entirely separate, but so alike in structure that one wonders whether they all share a single source. Lemuria came first, in the sense of being named first by Western writers. The name was proposed in 1864 by English zoologist Philip Sclater, who noticed a puzzle in the distribution of primates, lemurs in Madagascar, related primates in India and Sri Lanka, and proposed a now sunken land bridge to explain the pattern. It was a perfectly respectable hypothesis in its time. Continental drift had not yet been accepted. Once plate tectonics was worked out in the 20th century, the distribution was explained by the ancient connection of the continents themselves, and Sclater's Lemuria was no longer needed. But the name did not stay retired. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, incorporated Lemuria into her mystical system as one of the stages in humanity's spiritual evolution. A great continent in the Indian Ocean, whose inhabitants had been a proto-human people with their own civilization. Blavatsky's Lemuria was not Sclater's. Sclater's was a sober geological hypothesis that turned out to be wrong. Blavatsky's was esoteric teaching, never meant to be evaluated by geology. But the name, by the time Blavatsky was done with it, had acquired a second life as a spiritual and mythological concept, and has kept that second life ever since. Churchward, writing decades later, was clearly aware of the Lemuria concept. He had read the theosophical literature, but he did something specific. He relocated the lost continent from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, named it Mu, and presented his version as based on evidence, the tablets, rather than on mystical revelation. Some later writers have tried to reconcile the two by treating Lemuria and Mu as the same continent under different names. Others have argued they were different places. There is no way to settle this from the outside. Atlantis is the most famous branch of the lost continent family. It comes from Plato, specifically from two late dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, in which a character tells a story passed down through several intermediaries from an Egyptian priest who told the Athenian lawgiver Solon that the Greeks did not remember their own deepest history. The Egyptians, whose land had been more stable, remembered more, and what they remembered was a great civilization on a large island in the Atlantic, west of the Pillars of Hercules called Atlantis, which had been powerful and advanced, and had been swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune about 9,000 years before Solon's time. The details Plato gives are remarkably specific. Atlantis was larger than Libya, and Asia Minor combined. It was rich in natural resources, including a mysterious metal called orichalcum. Its capital city was arranged in concentric rings of water and land, with a great temple to Poseidon at its centre. Its kings had grown arrogant and expansionist, sending armies against the Mediterranean world, until they were defeated by the ancient Athenians. And then, in the aftermath of that defeat, the island was destroyed by earthquakes and floods and sank beneath the sea. Was Plato describing a real place? The debate has been running for 2,400 years and shows no sign of resolution. Some scholars, including many classical philologists, think he invented the whole story as a philosophical parable about what happens to civilizations that grow arrogant. The specificity of the details in this reading is simply good storytelling. Others think he was working from a genuine tradition, possibly based on the eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE, which devastated the Minoan civilization on Crete and the surrounding islands, and may have left echoes in later Greek memory. The timeline does not match. Plato says 9,000 years before Solon, which would place Atlantis around 9600 BCE, while Thera erupted in the 2nd millennium BCE, but some researchers have suggested that the Egyptian priest may have been counting in lunar months rather than solar years, or that the number was garbled in transmission. Still others take Plato's geography seriously and have proposed locations in the Atlantic, the Caribbean, even Antarctica. The debate has been running for over 2,000 years, and the proposed sites multiply with every generation. What matters for our purposes is not which of these views is correct. What matters is the structure. Atlantis, like Mu, is a great land, home to an advanced civilization, destroyed in a single catastrophe, surviving only in the traditions of peoples who were once in contact with it. The structure repeats. Kumari Kandam deserves its own mention, because of all these legends, it is the one with the deepest roots in a living tradition. The Tamil people of southern India have preserved for at least 2,000 years the Sangam literature. The writings of the Tamil academies, referencing traditions already ancient when the earliest surviving fragments were written down. Embedded in this literature is the memory of a great land stretching south from the tip of the Indian subcontinent, the original homeland of the Tamil people, the site of the first Tamil academies, the Sangams, where the Tamil language was refined over many generations. The literature speaks of 3 successive academies, each destroyed by inundation, each reconvened farther inland. The first Sangam, the tradition says, lasted 4,440 years before the sea took the city where it was held. The second lasted 3,700 years. The third, which produced the surviving Sangam literature, was held at Madurai, which still stands. Modern Tamil scholarship is careful. Scholars like Kamil Zvelabil have analysed the Kumari Kandam tradition in detail, distinguishing between what can be confirmed as literary fact. The Sangam texts are real. The tradition of successive academies is consistently reported across multiple sources, and what remains unverifiable, the existence of a large submerged landmass south of India. The geological evidence does not support a continent-scale land in that position, but the continental shelf south of India does extend significantly, and during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, the southern tip of India would have been considerably larger than it is now. Whether the Kumari Kandam tradition preserves a memory of that larger landmass, lost to the same post-glacial sea level rise that drowned Doggerland and Sunderland, is a question that cannot be answered from the texts alone. What can be said is that the Tamil people have maintained the memory of a lost homeland for at least 2 millennia in written form, and possibly for much longer in oral tradition before that. The memory is not casual. It is central to Tamil cultural identity. It is woven into the literature, the language, the self-understanding of one of the oldest continuously living cultures on Earth. So we have a pattern. Mu in the Pacific, Atlantis in the Atlantic, Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, Kumari Kandam south of India, Aztlan to the west of Mesoamerica, Hawaii across the Polynesian Sea, each pointing in a different direction, each described by a different people, and each carrying the same essential story. There was a homeland, and it is gone, and we came from there, and the knowledge we carry is a fragment of something that was once whole. A pattern repeated in too many places to easily dismiss, and yet not matching any specific location well enough to easily accept. A pattern that looks, from a distance, like the broken pieces of something that used to be a single story, scattered across the cultures of the world, and reassembled differently in each of them. Return now to the city. You have been walking in it for what feels like a long time, through the markets, past the teachers and the children, up to the crystal temple, down to the squares where the fires are lit at evening. The day has been peaceful, the way the legend insists all days in Mu were peaceful, right up until the day that they were not. Something has changed. The legend describes it not as a sudden rupture, but as a slow drift. A new faction has emerged among the keepers of the temples. They still observe the old forms, they still walk the chambers, but their interpretation of what the old forms mean has begun to shift in a direction the oldest masters have warned against, for as long as the memory of Mu goes back. The old teaching said, "The knowledge of the Nekal is a service. You learn it in order to give it back. You tend the crystal, you chart the stars, you heal the sick, you guide the children, and what you do these things for is the whole." The new faction asks a different question. Why share? If we hold the knowledge, if we alone understand what the crystal says and what the stars are teaching, why should we hand this over to everyone who asks? We could be the ones who decide. We could be the ones who lead. The old masters answered the question patiently. The knowledge does not belong to anyone. It passes through people the way water passes through a channel, and the channel does not own the water. To try to own the knowledge is to try to own something that by its nature cannot be owned, and the attempt will cost you, in the end, the knowledge itself. The master said this. The faction listened, and then nodded politely and went on arguing their question anyway, and the number of people on their side grew a little each year. This is how civilizations end. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow drift of interpretation in which the original meaning of a culture's deepest commitments gets softened and then softened again, until one day you look up and realize that the words are still being spoken, but they are no longer being meant. And then the earth began to respond. The ground trembled. Small tremors at first in the far southern provinces, then larger tremors, then the volcanoes, long-sleeping volcanoes in the central mountains, began to wake. Thin plumes of steam, then thicker plumes, then glows at night. The masters issued their final warning. Leave. Take what matters. Not the gold, not the monuments. Take the knowledge. Take the seeds. Take the children. Take the old people who still remember how the world used to work. Ships were prepared. The Nykel had always been shipbuilders of extraordinary skill, a people whose ocean-going vessels were capable of crossing seas without instruments, because the knowledge of the stars and the currents was embedded in their training from childhood. Some left. They set out in the early ships, carrying what they could carry, sailing toward the distant coasts the navigators had charted over generations, toward what would become India, toward what would become Southeast Asia, toward what would become the Americas, toward what would become Egypt by the long route around Africa, toward every shore that could be reached. Others stayed. The legend does not condemn them. Some did not believe the warnings. Some could not bring themselves to leave the only place they had ever known. Some were old. Some belonged to the new faction and had convinced themselves their power would protect them. And then the end came. The legend tells it in few words, as if even now, 12,000 years later, the people who remember it cannot bring themselves to tell it in many. In the space of a single night, the central lowlands of Mu dropped. The ground gave way, not in a single crack, but in a cascading series of collapses, as if the foundations of the continent had been quietly hollowed out from beneath over centuries and had finally reached the point where they could no longer hold. The volcanoes erupted together in a chain that lit the entire continent from horizon to horizon, and the ocean, which had been sitting patiently on the coasts of Mu for as long as anyone could remember, rushed inward, filling every valley, every canyon, every street, every temple, every square where fires had burned the night before. The crystal temples, whose great natural formations had risen out of the bedrock for longer than anyone could remember, were swallowed in minutes. The 7 cities, all of them, were gone before the morning. 64 million people, the legend says. You do not have to take the number literally. You can receive it the way you would receive a dream someone else is telling you, in a low voice, late at night, when you are almost asleep. The number is too large to feel as individual grief. It passes through the mind like a cloud across the moon. The ships, by now far out at sea, watched the sky behind them. They saw the red glow of the volcanoes on the clouds. They felt the first of the waves that the collapse had sent outward, enormous, long, almost gentle swells that lifted the ships and set them down, and moved on toward distant coastlines where the waves would eventually arrive as the great deluge that every culture on Earth now remembers. The sailors on those ships would not have looked back for long. The navigators among them would have been reading the stars already, calculating positions, adjusting course for coastlines they had studied on charts but never visited. The children would have been below deck, or wrapped in the arms of parents who were trying to keep their voices steady. The old people, the ones who still remembered the teachings in their fullest form, would have been sitting quietly, doing the only work that was left to them, which was to hold in their minds as clearly as they could every detail of the world they were leaving, so that when they reached whatever shore was waiting for them, they could begin the long work of passing it on. By morning, the glow on the horizon had faded. By the second day, there was nothing to see behind them but empty ocean. Somewhere under that ocean was everything they had ever known, the streets they had grown up in, the squares where their grandparents had sat on benches and told stories, the teachers who had taught them how to listen, the songs they had heard in the evening when the light turned amber and the whole city had seemed to glow from within. The ships sailed on. What happens to a civilization after it ends? The usual answer, for civilizations whose ending is well documented, is that the material culture collapses, the trade networks break down, the cities are abandoned or reduced to smaller settlements, and over time the memory of what once was is absorbed into the traditions of the peoples who survive in the ruins. Rome ended this way. The Bronze Age Aegean ended this way. The legend says Mu ended differently. Not because the process of losing the knowledge was different, that part was the same, but because of the deliberate dispersal. The ships did not all sail in one direction. They were sent out in every direction at once, with the specific intention that each ship would carry a different fragment of the old knowledge to a different shore, so that no single new disaster could wipe out the whole inheritance again. And the legend maps the diaspora onto the cultures of the ancient world in a way that is impossible to verify but strangely difficult to forget. Some ships sailed west toward India, and the people on those ships, the legend says, became the founders of the earliest Vedic traditions, the ancestors of the priestly caste that would eventually produce the Rig Veda and the Upanishads. The numbers encoded in the Vedas, the cycles of time, the references to ages predating the one we now live in, all of this, the legend says, is the shadow of the Nakal. The Rig Veda describes the universe in terms of vast cycles, the Mahayugas, each lasting 4,320,000 years, a number that is divisible by the precessional constants in ways that de Santillana and von der Chend found significant. The Hindu tradition of the 7 rishis, the 7 sages who preserve the Vedic knowledge across the ages, maps onto the Nakal concept of knowledge carried forward by a select group of inheritors. Some sailed toward Mesopotamia and became the teachers of the earliest Sumerians. The Sumerians themselves, in their own accounts, say their civilization was given to them by beings who came out of the water, the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought the arts of agriculture and building and writing to the peoples of the river valleys. The Apkallu are traditionally depicted as fish-clothed figures, which could mean many things, but could also simply mean they arrived by ship. The Sumerian king list, one of the earliest chronological documents in the world, describes a series of rulers before the flood and a series after it, with the flood serving as the dividing line between 2 kinds of history. Before the flood, the reigns of the kings last tens of thousands of years, numbers that are clearly symbolic, but that may encode a memory of a different kind of time, a time that predated the civilization the Sumerians themselves were aware of living in. Some sailed east toward the Americas and became, in the legends telling, the founders of the earliest pre-Mesoamerican traditions. The Mesoamerican stories of a feathered serpent teacher from across the sea, Quetzalcoatl among the Aztecs, Kukulkan among the Maya, Viracocha in the Andes, are, the legend says, dim memories of the same arrivals. Viracocha is particularly interesting in this context because the Incan traditions, as recorded by the Spanish chroniclers after the conquest, describe him not as a god in the usual sense, but as a teacher, someone who arrived at Lake Titicaca after a great flood, travelled through the land teaching the survivors how to farm, how to build, how to read the stars, and then departed across the ocean promising to return. The traditions say he was unlike the local population in appearance, though the specifics of the descriptions may have been filtered through the assumptions of the European chroniclers who wrote them down. Some sailed southwest toward what would become Oceania, becoming the ancestors of the Polynesian voyaging traditions, the keepers of the star charts whose descendants, thousands of years later, would navigate the entire Pacific using nothing but inherited knowledge. The Polynesian tradition of Hawaii, the ancestral homeland from which the voyaging canoes originally set out, appears in the traditions of virtually every Polynesian culture. From the Maori of New Zealand to the Hawaiians to the Marquesans, each with their own variant of the name, but all pointing to the same concept. A place of origin, across the water, that is no longer accessible. Whether Hawaii is a memory of an actual place or a mythological construct has been debated by scholars for generations. The legend of Mu says it is both. Some ships may have sailed even farther, toward Africa, around the southern tip of what is now Madagascar, and up the east coast to the Nile Delta. The people on those ships, the legend says, became the teachers of the earliest pre-dynastic Egyptians. The Egyptians themselves remembered a period before the pharaohs, which they called Zep Tepi, the first time, in which beings they described as gods walked on the earth and gave the knowledge of civilization to the people of the river. The Zep Tepe is described in Egyptian texts as being tens of thousands of years in the past, a date that mainstream scholarship has always treated as mythological exaggeration, because the Egyptian dynastic period begins only about 5,000 years ago. But the Egyptians insisted on the older date. The Palermo stone, one of the earliest Egyptian annals, records a list of kings and gods stretching back into a deep past that the Egyptians themselves treated as historical, not mythological. The Turin king list, though fragmentary, similarly records divine rulers whose reigns precede recorded history by many thousands of years. Each of these diasporic arrivals, the legend says, was a seed, a fragment of the old knowledge planted in new soil, growing differently depending on the climate and the people and the conditions it encountered. The Vedic fragment produced one civilization, the Sumerian fragment produced another, the Egyptian fragment produced another, each recognizable at some deep level as a descendant of the same original source, because they all still contained, in broken form, the same core ideas about the stars, the earth, and the human body, and each of them eventually lost its direct memory of where the fragment had come from. The later Egyptians did not remember Mu, they remembered only the first time. The later Indians did not remember Mu, they remembered the Yugas, a series of ages, each lesser than the one before, with the current age, the Kali Yuga, described as the lowest and most forgetful. The later Mesoamericans remembered a homeland called Aztlan, which lay across the water to the west. But the specific memory of a single source was gone from all of them. In each case, the memory softened with each generation, until only the shape was left. Whether the legend is literally true, or only a beautiful way of organizing the scattered pieces of human memory, the parallel structures in the world's oldest traditions are there. They are in the astronomical knowledge of cultures that developed it independently, or inherited it. They are in the megalithic monuments. They are in the flood myths. They are in the structural parallels between sacred texts that no ancient scribe could have coordinated. The parallel is not proof, it is a pattern. And patterns, in archaeology as in life, are sometimes coincidence, and sometimes the footprint of something real. The legend says it is a footprint. The listener can decide for themselves. Let us talk, for a moment, about what we know is down there. The ocean floor of the Pacific is not featureless. It is crossed by mid-ocean ridges, punctuated by volcanic islands and seamounts, and carpeted in places with sediment that has been accumulating for millions of years. Plate tectonics tells us, conclusively, that no large continent has occupied the central Pacific in the relevant time frame. The oceanic crust beneath the Pacific is basaltic, thin and young relative to continental crust. It does not behave like a continent. It does not sink like a continent. Churchward's map of Mu in the literal geological sense is wrong, but plate tectonics also tells us something else. The continental shelves, the shallow underwater extensions of every continent and major island group, were above water during the Ice Age, and those shelves, in the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions, are vast. Sunderland, as we discussed, was larger than modern India. The Sewell Shelf, connecting Australia to New Guinea, was similarly enormous. The shelves around Japan, around the Philippines, around the islands of Melanesia and Micronesia, all of these were wider, higher, and more habitable during the Ice Age than they are now. Added together, the habitable land that has been lost in the Pacific Basin alone since the Ice Age amounts to millions of square kilometres, and almost none of it has been systematically explored for archaeological remains. This is not because archaeologists are uninterested. It's because underwater archaeology is among the most technically demanding and expensive forms of scientific inquiry in the world. Working at the depths involved, 20 to 120 metres on most continental shelves, requires specialised diving equipment, remotely operated vehicles, multi-beam sonar systems, and the kind of long-term institutional funding that most research programs simply do not have. A single underwater archaeological survey can cost more than an entire season of land-based excavation, and the conditions, poor visibility, strong currents, marine growth obscuring surfaces, make it difficult to achieve the resolution needed to distinguish between natural geological formations and the remains of human construction. The result is a situation that is almost absurd in its dimensions. We know, from geological evidence, that approximately 25 million square kilometres of land that was inhabited during the Ice Age is now underwater. We know, from the archaeological record of the period, that the human populations living on that land were capable of building structures. Göbekli Tepe's massive stone enclosures were constructed during this exact period, by people with the same basic tool set. We know from the genetic evidence that the flooding of these lands displaced large populations and triggered migrations that reshaped the human map of the world. And we have explored, for archaeological purposes, a tiny fraction of 1% of the submerged landscape. What has been found in the scattered surveys that have been done is suggestive. The Yonaguni Formation we discussed earlier sits on one such submerged shelf. Whether it's natural or artificial, it is proof that the seabed in Mu's supposed territory contains structures worth investigating. Masaki Kimura has identified what he believes to be additional related structures off the main island of Okinawa, claims that remain disputed but have not been definitively resolved. In the waters around Pohnpei, underwater surveys in the 1970s and 1980s found basalt pillars on the seafloor beyond the known extent of Nan Madol, suggesting the complex may have been more extensive than what is visible today. Off the western coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, marine surveys have detected what some researchers interpret as the remains of a large submerged settlement, though the interpretation is disputed. And in the waters around the Indonesian archipelago, the drowned heartland of Sunderland, the seabed has barely been surveyed at all for archaeological purposes, despite the fact that it was dry land home to human populations for tens of thousands of years. Each of these scattered reports is a hint, not proof, not confirmation, but a hint, that the submerged shelves of the Pacific and Indian Ocean basins contain more than geology. They contain the unexamined remains of a world we have lost. If the Yonaguni Formation turns out to be artificial, it was built on land that was above water during the period the legend says Mu existed. If Gunung Padang turns out to be as old as its most controversial interpreters claim, it was built on the highland edge of a tropical continent that is now mostly under the sea. If the anomalies off Pohnpei turn out to be extensions of Nan Madol's builder's work, they were laid down on shores that no longer exist. We do not know. That is the honest answer. We have not looked. The legend of Mu says there is a drowned civilization down there. Mainstream geology says there is not. At least not a single unified continent. But between those two positions lies a vast and mostly unexplored middle ground. The possibility that the submerged continental shelves of the world contain the remains of human communities and structures that we have not yet found, simply because we have not yet looked. This is not a fringe position. This is a straightforward inference from facts that are not in dispute. The gap in our knowledge is not a mystery. It is a logistics problem, and it may be the largest logistics problem in the history of archaeology. Step back from the ocean for a moment. Come back to the room you're in, the bed you're lying in, the quiet breath moving in and out of your body as the night settles around you. What have we been doing for the last while? We have been following a story that most careful historians would set aside politely and move on from, and yet the story has taken us through questions that are genuinely open. How did ancient cultures know what they knew? Why do flood myths repeat across peoples who never met? What lies on the continental shelves that were above water during the Ice Age? Who built Göbekli Tepe before agriculture was supposed to exist? And where did their knowledge come from? What happened at the Younger Dryas boundary 12,800 years ago? What is buried inside Gunung Padang? Why do the Polynesians navigate by the stars the way they do? Why do the Australians remember coastlines that have been underwater for 7,000 years? These are real questions. They are not answered by the legend of Mu, but they are sharpened by it. The legend gives them a shape they do not otherwise have, and maybe that is what the legend is for. Maybe its point has never been to be literally true. Maybe its point is to be a kind of container, a vessel big enough to hold all the questions at once, and light enough to carry, and strong enough that the questions do not fall out when the vessel is handed from one generation to the next. A mnemonic for the species. Think about what a mnemonic does. It takes information that is difficult to hold in the mind, scattered, disconnected, too complex for any single memory to contain, and gives it a shape, a story, a song, a sequence of images that carries the information forward even when the person carrying it does not fully understand what they are carrying. The oral traditions of Australia have done this for at least 7,000 years, preserving accurate geographical information about coastlines that no living person has seen above water. The flood myths of the world have done this for even longer, preserving the memory of a real catastrophic event. the end of the Ice Age, the rising of the seas, in a form that every generation can receive and pass on without needing to understand the geology behind it. The legend of Mu may be doing the same thing on a larger scale. It may be compressing the entire catastrophic history of the end of the Ice Age, the drowning of Doggerland, the submersion of Sunderland, the loss of coastal lands on every continent, the displacement of millions of people, the destruction of whatever those people had built over the preceding tens of thousands of years, into a single story about a single continent. The story is wrong in its specifics. There was no single Pacific continent, but the story is pointing at something real. The fact that the world our species inhabited during the Ice Age was radically different from the world we inhabit now, and that the transition between the two was violent, and that a great deal was lost in the process, and that the loss has never been fully accounted for. Human civilizations have risen and fallen before. That is not controversial. Göbekli Tepe was built 11,500 years ago by people we used to believe were simple hunter-gatherers and who turned out to be considerably more complicated. Before Göbekli Tepe, there were other sites we have not yet found. The idea that human history is much longer and much more complicated than the standard textbook version has become almost mainstream in the last 2 decades. And consider what we mean when we say a civilization has been lost. We usually mean that its physical remains have deteriorated past the point of recognition, or that its written records have been destroyed, or that its descendants have moved on and forgotten where they came from. But there is another way a civilization can be lost, a way that is unique to the end of the Ice Age, and that is to have the land it was built on physically disappear beneath the ocean. A civilization lost in that way leaves almost no trace. Its buildings are underwater. Its tools are buried under meters of marine sediment. Its people have scattered to other continents, where they have been absorbed into new populations. The only thing that survives is the memory, carried forward in the stories and the traditions and the fragments of knowledge that the survivors managed to bring with them. If such a civilization existed, not necessarily the Grand Pacific Empire Churchward imagined, but something, some set of communities, some network of coastal cultures with their own knowledge and their own achievements on the lands that were swallowed when the Ice Age ended, then the legend of Mu is what its memory would look like after 12,000 years of retelling. Softened, simplified, merged from many separate stories into one, but still carrying in its bones the shape of something real. Take the legend at that level, and it becomes hard to dismiss. At that level, it is not a claim about geology. It is a claim about memory, about the fact that human beings do not easily let go of the memory of the worlds their ancestors lost. There is another level on which the legend may be worth sitting with, not as history, not as memory, as warning. The specific shape of the Mu story, the faction that chose power over service, the old masters whose warnings were ignored, the earth that responded to a civilization out of balance, describes a pattern that civilizations of any era can fall into. The moment when a culture's knowledge becomes detached from the service it was originally meant for, and begins to be hoarded, and begins to be used as a tool of power rather than a gift of care. The slow drift that hollows out a tradition without anyone noticing. The late stage at which the warnings are still being spoken but are no longer being heard. Every civilization that has fallen, and many have, over the course of recorded history alone, has had its version of this pattern. The original commitments of the culture, the things that had made it strong and coherent in the first place, were gradually replaced by something that looked similar from the outside but had a different purpose on the inside. The language of service was maintained. The practice of service was not. The legend of Mu tells the oldest version of this story. It tells it about a civilization so old that no one can say for certain whether it existed. And it tells it with a consequence so total, the loss not just of the civilization but of the land itself, that the warning carries a weight no historical example can match. The legend of Mu compresses this pattern into its most essential form, knowledge as service or knowledge as power. That is the choice the legend says Mu faced. That is the choice it says Mu got wrong, and the consequence of getting it wrong in the legend's telling was not merely political decline or economic contraction. It was the loss of everything, the continent itself. This is mythic language. It is not meant to be taken as a literal prediction of geological consequences for moral failures, but it is a way of saying something that is true in a different register. that civilizations that forget why they exist do not usually survive, and that the things they lose are sometimes things that cannot be rebuilt. This is not a comfortable warning. But it is one of the things the legend is trying to say, and it is worth noting before we let it settle. And there is a third level, the most personal, the quietest. The legend of Mu is, among other things, a picture of what a human society might look like if it were organised around a completely different set of assumptions. Work as service rather than survival. Education as the unfolding of each child's nature rather than the imposition of a curriculum. Healing as attunement with a larger system rather than repair of an isolated machine. Community as a relationship of trust so deep that the idea of hoarding has no meaning. This picture may be fantasy. Almost certainly it idealises beyond recognition any society that has ever actually existed, including any that may have lived 12,000 years ago. Human beings are difficult to organise along any lines, and the idea that 64 million of them once lived together without conflict is probably the most clearly mythological element of the entire legend. But even as dream, the picture has value. It gives us a measure, not a blueprint, a measure, a way of noticing the distance between the world we have and the world we can imagine. And the distance itself is information. It tells us that we know, somewhere, that things could be different. That the current arrangement is not the ceiling of what human beings are capable of. That the longing for a better way of living together is not a weakness. It is one of the oldest things about us. The legend of Mu does not ask anything of you. It does not ask you to believe it. It does not ask you to change your life. It does not ask you to feel guilty about the gap between Mu and the world outside your window. It only holds up the picture. It only remembers. And it invites you, if you are willing, to sit with the picture for a little while and let your own thoughts do the rest. The legend does not ask. The legend only remembers, and we can take from the memory whatever we are ready to take. Somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, at depths no diver can reach without specialised equipment, there are coastlines that were above sea level 12,000 years ago. People lived on those coastlines. We know this not because of Churchward, but because of the basic math of ice ages and sea levels, which tells us that 120 metres of water came up over the course of a few thousand years, and the land that now lies under that water was dry land when the ice was still holding on to the sea. Who those people were, and what they built and what they knew, we do not fully know. The record of their lives is scattered across the seabed in pieces we have not yet figured out how to read. Some of it may never be readable. Some of it may be waiting quietly for the right expedition with the right equipment to bring a piece of it back to the surface. Until then, we have the legend. The legend is imperfect. It comes through the writings of a man who may have been sincere and may have been mistaken, and almost certainly embellished what he thought he had found. It contradicts the geology. It asks us to believe things the evidence does not support, and yet the legend keeps surviving. It has outlasted the scholars who dismissed it in the 1930s. It has outlasted the New Age writers who recycled it in the 1990s. It is still here in the 21st century, being told in voices like this one, carried forward by an audience that has somehow decided that the story is worth hearing. Why? Maybe because it reminds us of something we do not want to forget. That human history is longer than we were taught. That civilizations rise and fall, and the rising ones do not always remember the fallen ones well. That the ocean has swallowed more than we know, and the ocean will swallow more before we are done. And the things that survive the swallowing are often the things that seemed least important at the time. The stories, the songs, the patterns in the old sacred texts, the shapes pressed into memory in a form resilient enough to cross 10,000 years of retelling without completely falling apart. Maybe because it reminds us that what we build is not permanent, that the pyramids we are proudest of will one day be the subject of someone else's legends, told around fires we cannot imagine, by people who will not remember our names but who will remember that something was here once, something that knew things, something that tried. Maybe because it holds open a window onto a version of ourselves that we are not currently, a version in which the knowledge is a service, and the community is a whole, and the earth is a partner rather than a resource, and the window, just by being held open, gives us something to look toward. You're almost asleep now. You do not have to hold on to any of this. Let the names drift away. Churchward, the Nakal, Göbekli Tepe, and its T-shaped pillars standing in the Turkish dust. Doggerland, with its forests of oak and elm now buried under the North Sea. Sunderland, where the Java Sea laps quietly over what was once the largest tropical continent on Earth. The Crystal Temple, the Seven Cities, the ships sailing out in every direction on the last night before the ocean came. Let all of it loosen in your mind and let it go wherever the stories that have done their work for the night are allowed to go. Somewhere under the Pacific, the old coastlines are still there. They are not going anywhere. The ocean above them is patient. It has been patient for 12,000 years already, and it can be patient for 12,000 more, and the things that are under it will still be under it in the morning when you wake up. Somewhere in a library, Churchward's old books are still sitting on a shelf, dismissed, never fully explained away, still being picked up occasionally by readers who are not sure whether to believe them and cannot quite bring themselves to put them back. Somewhere in the oral traditions of the Rapa Nui and the Tamil and the Polynesian navigators and the Aboriginal Australians who remember coastlines that have been underwater for 7,000 years, fragments of something very old are still being carried forward, still being told to children at bedtime in one form or another, still being remembered without anyone quite knowing why. And tonight, for the last while, you have been one of the people carrying it. You have walked the streets of a city that may never have existed. You have sat in a square at sunset while the light turned amber on the pale walls. You have heard, faintly, a song coming from a building you did not enter. You have watched, from a safe distance, the ocean come in on a night that the legend says changed everything. The legend gave it a shape. The shape gave us a story. The story gave you somewhere to be, for a little while, on the long road towards sleep. That is what stories are for. If this story stayed with you, if it gave you somewhere quiet to rest, even for a little while, I would be grateful if you would press the like button below. It helps the channel find the people who need it, and it lets me know that this way of telling the story is worth continuing. If you're not ready to sleep yet, or if you want to let the voice carry you a little further, there is a playlist waiting for you. More stories like this one. More ancient places to walk through. More questions with no easy answers and no test at the end. The playlist will find you. And if something in tonight's story made you think, if there was a detail that caught you, or a question you have been carrying that this story touched the edge of, I would love to hear about it in the comments. The conversations there are some of the best parts of this channel. Your thoughts make these stories better. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Let your breathing slow. Let the last of the images drift away. The ocean is warm and dark and full of things we have not found yet, and the night is long enough to hold you, and the morning will be there when it is there, and none of what you heard tonight is anything you need to carry with you when you wake up. The legend will still be here. It has waited 12,000 years. It can wait a little longer. You have done your part. You listened. That is enough. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. And somewhere in your dreams tonight, if you find yourself walking up a path of dark volcanic stone from a long, pale beach, toward a city whose buildings catch the amber light of a sunset you do not quite recognize, you will know where you are. You have been there before. Everyone has. The memory is old. The memory is ours. Good night.